Global market insights, local market intel, and expert opinion. The cocktail of success that keeps you going in the world of business decision making. And here in BISNOMICS, in your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes, that's exactly what we aim to deliver to you in a platter. I'm Tarandu Amrasekara, and today we are focused on the question that is doing circles in many business forums, and that is none other than to IMF or not to IMF. Many different opinions are being brought forward on this regard, but what's the exact truth? Why did we end up at a position that we need to be discussing this? For example, by end November, the official reserves of Sri Lanka were somewhere close to $1 billion, having fallen down from quite a high level before the pandemic. But is this a problem that we can blame on the pandemic, or are there more fundamental problems that are contributing to this? To discuss about this and more, we have an expert joining us who is none other than Mr. Chayu Damsinghe, and he is the head of product development for the macroeconomic sector at Frontier Research. Chayu, welcome to BISNOMICS. Absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Tarandu. Glad to be here.
Chayu, now let's ask the question that everyone wants to know and answer for. How did we fall to such a low point? Now, let me just check with you on some of the numbers of foreign reserves of the other countries and especially our neighbors. Bangladesh, by end of 2019, they were having around $33 billion, and by October 2021, they are having somewhere around 47, grown once again. India, 450 to 638 by November 2021. These are rough figures, I'm sure, give or take. But Thailand, 224 to 246. Vietnam, 79 by end of 2009. $79 billion to $105 billion by August 2021. Sri Lanka, $8 billion by end of 2019. And by 2021 September, 3 billion, and we know that by November we were down to somewhere close to 1 billion. Surely we can't blame everything on the pandemic, Chayu. So why exactly has Sri Lanka fallen into this? I think we can call it an abyss.
Well, Taran, this has been a problem. The underlying factors behind this has been a problem for decades. And in fact, the finance minister in his budget speech this year gave a very good explanation of what's happening. It's that for decades we've had essentially too much expenditure for the country to bear, and over time that has to be borne by the fact that we have to take on either a lot of debt, or we have to either grow our export sector. So our export sector hasn't grown to the extent that it needs to sustain our very large welfare state, which is of course a moral requirement. That's a completely different story altogether. But in the absence of our export sectors growing as much, we've needed to take on debt, and ultimately we have no real way out of it unless we deal with that debt situation directly head on. There's no real way out of that situation.
So the situation that we are in, Chayu, I mean, surely it's not something that is sustainable, because now as we go into this recording, we are towards the end of 2021, mind you, or rather we are now at the point of early 2022. We don't know what the figures and numbers will be for 2021 December as at now, but surely what happens if the dollar reserves further go down? Let's say, for example, hypothetically and theoretically, let's say we hit $0 available in this country. What happens then? I believe that's what you call a country going bankrupt.
To be fair, I don't think a country can go down to zero. Before it goes down to zero, it loses its ability to effectively function in the international system and also effectively function locally. Now, the $1 billion number that you referred to, that's the foreign currency reserves we have. We also have approximately another $400 to $600 million in gold, some reserve assets and the like, but so 1.6 to 1 billion in reserves. But essentially, when you go below, say, let's say $500 million, you are unable to pay for any imports because no other international banks are confirming your country's imports and letters of credit. You are unable to meet any.
So basically, we can't import oil.
generally what happens for most countries, what we see in other countries, is that food, essential food and oil comes through some bilateral partner. For example, these new deals we're seeing with India would probably be in that direction, but everything else basically stops. You are unable to get that confirmed through the private sector system, and therefore that's an issue that comes up. And pharmaceuticals, in fact, is one of the things that can get missed there, because pharmaceuticals in most countries, like in Sri Lanka, are through the private system, which means they can often get kind of mislaid.
And Chayu, I believe that we have seen some similar situations in countries like Lebanon now. Mind you, Lebanon at one time was called the Switzerland of the Middle East. That was, of course, before some of these wars breaking out and so on. But aren't we seeing some similar situations in Lebanon?
Lebanon's situation is, from our perspective, a lot more severe than Sri Lanka's, and we don't think Sri Lanka will go that far just yet.
I think you just made my whole week, and I'm sure a lot of the people would be happy to hear there is some hope for Sri Lanka.
Yes, Lebanon's, for example, their unofficial exchange rate is something like 24,000 times depreciation compared to the official rate. For the last 2 years, they've essentially not had a single government. It's been under different transitory authorities. There's no body to actually take economic decision. They are in hyperinflationary spiral. That's far beyond what we expect for Sri Lanka. As conditions on the ground in Sri Lanka do get worse, they won't go that bad. We do expect Sri Lanka has shown itself able to shift policy, change policy, even change governments if needed. So we think that's changing policy is more likely for Sri Lanka than this complete collapse like we've seen in Lebanon.
Understood. So if you look at the big topic that everyone is talking about, IMF. Now, some parties are saying, no, we should go for IMF. Some parties are saying, no, we should not go for the IMF. And if you go for IMF, these problems will be happening. But in reality, what exactly is the role of the IMF in supporting economies? And I believe that though we are now talking about IMF, that Sri Lanka should go or not go, I believe that IMF has been supporting Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan economy in some way or the other over the years as well. So, Chayu, the question is simple. What's the role of IMF in supporting economies? Number one. Number two, how has the IMF, International Monetary Fund, been supporting Sri Lanka all this while in some way or the other?
So, the role of the IMF for most countries is to serve as some sort of backup plan. So, when countries do get into trouble, there are these credit cycles, debt cycles that happens to many countries
and
over time.
You have to be a member of the IMF.
You have to be a member of the IMF. Yeah. Very many countries are.
And this is the organization that I believe started off many decades back in order to make sure the whole currency rate fixing doesn't happen and to encourage the free floating currencies. But then later they shifted the role to supporting the economies, as you said.
Yes. So the IMF and other what we call Bretton Woods institution kind of originated from that basis, but now of course it plays functionally a role something closer to probably the closest that the world has right now to lender of last resort. When countries get in trouble, they can't get support anywhere else, they go to the IMF and get some temporary finance so that until they get their house in order, the country doesn't completely collapse. That's essentially the role the IMF plays for most economies these days.
So, how has the IMF been supporting Sri Lanka all this while?
So, Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF quite a few times in the previous century, and of course multiple times in the last few decades as well. And each time what happens is that Sri Lanka is in some sort of debt issue, some issue with our external sector. We need to take policies to fix it. But the time needed for those policies to result in benefit does not exist. So you need the IMF or some party to add credibility to the process and to provide some financing in the short term so that we engage with that process more constructively, and we also have time for any benefits of policy we do take to result and actually accumulate any benefit onto the external sector. So we've had a program in 2009, in the 2016-17 period we had programs, so all of those have gone in that direction.
All right. So we haven't been able to benefit or rather experience the full benefit of IMF restructuring in some way or the other. Because I believe when you go to the IMF, there are, in fact, I'm coming to my next question with that. So a lot of, we hear even politicians saying that if you go to the IMF, they'll have lots of rules and regulations, lots of conditions, and, and some ministers are even saying we should ask from the public whether we should go for the IMF or not. And there's so much of topics coming in, and in fact, the IMF is shown as more like a silver bullet, which I don't think it is for all the economic problems of the country, Chayu. But when you borrow from the IMF versus borrowing from another government, let's say, for example, China, which has been like a by default strategy of the successive governments in Sri Lanka. But borrowing from the IMF versus borrowing from other governments, what's the fundamental difference?
So whenever you borrow from someone, you have to give something back, either in interest, and sometimes it ends up being some sort of other conditions. Now, when you're talking to China, it might be something political, it might be something geostrategic. We are talking to India right now, there's talk of perhaps political conditions attached to it, investment opportunities attached to that. They might not necessarily all have to be financial conditions. So the IMF's basis is that the IMF does not give you lending or give you support to grow your economy. It's not giving you support for investment. That's not what the IMF's role is. The IMF's role is to stop you from completely collapsing. But it's not going to essentially just keep bailing you out over and over again. For the IMF,
sounds more like a ventilator to me.
It's very much that's very similar to the role the IMF plays. You're in trouble, you need to fix your problems, but
we'll keep you alive. We'll keep you alive until then.
Exactly, that's essentially the role the IMF plays.
So when the government of Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF in the past, how has those interactions been, and what have been the requests from them? Because I believe that there are certain conditions that comes in. I mean, they want certain restructuring to be shown, because I believe what they want to see is, are you having the discipline to get your house in order? Am I correct?
That's an accurate way to put it. So what happens, and not just in Sri Lanka, but in lots of other countries, Argentina and Pakistan are good examples for this, where you have countries, and especially political leaders, taking these IMF program. So a restructuring specifically something slightly different. We can get to that, but taking up those conditions, those adjustments, enough for the economy to see some sort of recovery. And then, because those reforms are quite painful, there's no way around it, these political leaders often end up turning the other way and just going back that same path.
So they get the money from the IMF.
They get some money from the IMF. They take some of the pain. And then, because it's politically difficult for them, they go and start spending again and doing the same thing. And sometime later, they'll again end up in the same hole. So Argentina, Pakistan, multiple IMF programs across the years as a result of that pattern.
It's like a vicious cycle that keeps on continuing. Who heads the IMF and who funds this IMF, Chayu?
So the IMF is headed by the managing director is appointed by the different constituent countries. So the IMF is appointed, and everyone's appointed through the member countries, which are, I think, vast majority, I think, if not all of the UN member nations are members of the IMF as well. So they have different voting abilities, different voting powers, depending on the sizes, the economy, and the way that structure works. So there is a perception that the IMF is more aligned towards more classical, economical, liberal thinking, and that's not untrue in the sense that is where the economic thinking comes from. But it's also not necessarily true that they're directly politically aligned either. But of course, countries that have greater voting power and greater say in the UN inevitably have greater say over the IMF as well.
So, as at now, the IMF, are they in any kind of discussion with the Sri Lankan government on any possibility of supporting the economy, or is it still in the initial focus?
So once every while, so on a regular basis, the IMF has what's known as Article 4 consultations with every country, with every member of the nation. That's not a program or anything. So right now, Sri Lanka the IMF is in Sri Lanka for one of those Article 4 consultations. I think until somewhere during the December period, they're in the country. So that is not necessarily a program. What can happen is that would be a good opportunity for the Sri Lankan government to actually approach the IMF and look, in addition to this consultation that we anyway going to be having, how about we start talking about an actual program itself. So that could be a good opportunity, but not necessarily something.
So have we paid off whatever loans we have taken from the IMF in the past, or are there any still programs in progress?
So the programs that we have had in the IMF are either concluded or stopped midway. There are repayments that need to be paid, but those are not very significant repayments, because those are usually arranged in a way that, for a country like Sri Lanka, which hasn't taken massive loans from the IMF, hasn't needed a massive bailout from the IMF, they are smaller amounts and spread over a more extended period of time, so it's not necessarily something Sri Lanka struggles with.
What is stopping Sri Lanka from going for a restructuring program with the IMF? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back to BISNOMICS, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. We are in conversation with Chayu Damsinghe from Frontier Research on the possibility of Sri Lanka going for an IMF bailout. Is it necessary? If so, what would be required and the nitty-gritty of it? Chayu, right now, we see two schools of thoughts. Some parties which say we have to go for IMF support program. Some parties saying no, we should not go for it, and that if we go for it, it will be having massive consequences, like the pensions will be asked to be reduced, and that government workers will have to be cut down, and so on. What is the real truth in this whole scenario?
So the specifics of that pensions are going to be cut down or government servers need to be fired, that seems quite unlikely. What the IMF generally asks for is the measures needed for a country to look at where and why is it in this debt situation, what can it do to deal with that. So that often ends up being, if there are artificial controls on the economy, right now we have
Plenty of them,
strict control on the exchange rate, for example. We had ones on the interest rate, those have thankfully been tapered away. We have on a few other controls as well, those have to be kind of taken away. And if there's excessive spending in the government side, the IMF does ask for that to be balanced. So that can be done through cutting spending by that kind of action, or it can also instead be through raising taxes. It can be through privatization of certain assets. There are different ways you can get through that. But what is unavoidable though is pain. That if we go to an IMF program, essentially because IMF requires you to take those structural adjustments, those will be painful. There's no way around that because we've been avoiding that pain for so long. All of that kind of comes rushing in at once. So there's no way to avoid that. The question is, how bad is the situation going to be? The IMF to us seems
the more worse situation we go to the IMF in, the pain will be higher.
The pain will undoubtedly be higher, and the more we delay, the harder the structural adjustments we have to take. And the fact is, if we don't go to the IMF at all, and we also don't get money from some friend of ours, we are in a far, far worse situation than if we went to the IMF. So it's very much that policymakers seem to be caught between a rock and a hard place.
Rock and hard place is indeed the word there, Chayu. Now, with regard to the IMF program, do you think that it's high time Sri Lanka went for one?
We would say that it's high time that Sri Lanka took some sort of measures to deal with that kind of situation that they're having. Because if not, and if we don't get any money, then we are in what is essentially a complete default situation. Now that's very negative. That's not something that we really want for the country.
And investors will run away from Sri Lanka as well when they see a default situation.
Most investors have already left the country, so there's not much left to go for foreign investors. But what it would prevent them from coming back anytime soon.
Correct.
So the IMF in that context is merely the vehicle through which these reforms happen. It doesn't have to be. If there are, for example, an example would be Greece and their debt crisis in 2013. The IMF was not involved. The EU, Germany and the other countries got together to do that instead. So it's very possible that, for example, if India cajoles the country enough, it is possible to get that through. China could do it. Many other countries could do it. But oftentimes it falls to the IMF because the IMF tends to have fewer political requirements
Correct.
than bilateral partners do.
I believe there will be lesser political conditions as well.
Yes, most of the time the conditions that the IMF would have would be primarily economic. Now, those could have political implications, sure, but the IMF is not going to ask for, say, do this to the constitution or have this election. Those are not things the IMF will be asking for.
Understood. So, if you look at our current dollar reserve situation, how gloomy and dire is it, the situation, and at the same time, moving into 2022, what can we expect? Do you see any silver lining amidst all these dark clouds, Chayu? What does your research show?
The reserve situation, so you mentioned this at the beginning as well, that the end November reserves number, what we take is the full reserves number of 1.6 billion.
Yeah, that's with the gold and everything.
That's with all of that. It does take some time to liquidate that, but let's assume that happens. The issue is that is a very low amount because in January we have $500 million of a sovereign bond to be paid, and between January and February we have approximately anywhere between $400 to $800 million in other SLDBs, as well as possibly other debt repayments that are a little bit opaque that we don't have a lot of data on. So basically, it could very well be that by the end of January we have more debt repayments than we have money. So in that context, by the end of January, we've run out of money. Of course, if India gives us a little bit of bridging finance, maybe 500 million, that delays it another month. If you get a little bit more, it delays another month. But essentially, unless we get something to delay it, we are already at that point. Every day, every week could bring us some sort of new revelation that really takes us further and further down this slide.
Have we become like the begging bowl of Asia?
In a way, if we are asking all our partners for help, we are at a similar situation. But of course, unless, and I think it's clear to even our bilateral partners that this is, Sri Lanka is going through this crisis right now. For them, the question is, look, why are we going to give our money to pay off this country's creditors? What do we get in return? So oftentimes that what do we get in return tends to be that's a very dangerous question. We don't know what it might be.
And we hear sometimes even the politicians are saying, look, we gave this project to this country, so now to keep the other party happy, to keep India happy, we'll have to give a project for them, etc. And it already sounded like we are in a rock and a hard place. This current dollar crisis just makes it worse.
Very much. So what we've seen in other countries as well, and I'll bring the example of Laos here, who had a debt issue, and they ended up giving up the entire electricity grid to China. Now, one could argue
I believe even in Zambia it's a similar situation. The electricity is run by the. There are so many African countries.
Exactly, you have that situation. Now, one could argue whether that's a bad thing or not, based on whether you want a private company running that or not. That's a completely different question. But those are decisions that countries will have to make, and we cannot, I guess, ignore the fact that those decisions will have to be made.
Why I brought up Zambia was, Chayu, because I'm not very sure whether it's electricity, but there are so many African countries, even Kenya for that matter, where for the loans they've taken, they have to end up giving lots of different areas of their very vital economic components to other countries from whom they borrow. Not only China, but it can be to any of those other countries. So, from your perspective, like you said, yes, we are depending on borrowing from all these parties, but borrowing is always not a sustainable solution, as you very correctly mentioned. Chayu, where do you see things turning around, and is this issue due to the lack of tourism? Is that one of the main concerns? Because we don't see our tourism bouncing back either. In countries like Seychelles and so on, the tourism is booming, but we are struggling to attract those tourists as well. What exactly is the root cause here? You mentioned, yes, we are spending too much and so on, our imports are more than exports, but the reason for things to get this bad in just two years, of course 2 years of the pandemic, is it a case that our tourism hasn't bounced back, or is it that our exports are not value adding enough? What exactly is the problem, Chayu?
So Sri Lanka has two problems actually right now. One is this solvency crisis that happens as a result of us accumulating a lot of debt over time. So regardless of how much inflows or not we get, we still have 100% of our GDP in our public debt. That's rising. So that's unsustainable regardless of how much money we're getting now. That's a problem that even if not now, one day we'll have to reckon with. It has been hastened right now as a result of what we have, this liquidity crisis right now, and that's very much as a result of the tourism impact, not only the pandemic, mind you, but also Easter Sunday and well as Sunday. So we had 3 years now of weak tourism, and as of 2021,
and
very
weak. The third one you mentioned, COVID, Easter Sunday?
No, it's COVID and the 2 years of, 2 years of COVID and the Easter Sunday attack. So if not for those events, perhaps our tourism sector might have been giving us another 6, 7, 8 billion than we currently get, which is less than 500 million.
Yes.
So that if we had that money, this year would not be a problem, next year would not be a problem. But someday, unless we fix those underlying problems, these problems would still have to have caught up with us.
So what are the policy decisions needed to correct these underlying problems? Because you're into macroeconomics, and macroeconomics is all about the big picture. So from the way you say it, Chayu, what policy decisions are needed? Maybe painful ones, but what does the research show? And maybe there are countries that have been through similar situations that has now come out of it. What are those painful policy decisions needed to start rectifying? Because the way I see it, this is more like you have a ticking time bomb right next to you, and you just continue to play deaf and blind to that just for the sake of convenience, because no one wants to address the real pain or issue.
So there are many different ways that you can take that pain, many different kinds of policies that you can take. I'm not going to give a decision on what should happen, but what I can say is for Sri Lanka, what is likely to happen and what is likely to help. What we think is most likely to happen is for the country to take an IMF program, restructure our debt, take that pain and for that to result in, yes, a tough year next year, but then for the economy to recover and recover quite well into the years moving forward. That's the most likely scenario that we see.
Yes.
That would involve, in that scenario, not only pushing our debt to the future and talking to our creditors, but also floating the exchange rate, interest rates moving in line with inflation, possibly likely increasing taxes, but also possibly cutting down expenditure and some privatization where possible.
So will loss-making entities be expected to be privatized by the IMF?
The IMF would ask for that. The government, it's up to the government whether they would go ahead with that. I think as the country goes deeper into economic pain on the ground, it actually becomes politically easier to take those kinds of actions rather than perhaps, so it's easier an argument politically to make, look, let's sell off, let's say, Sri Lankan Airlines instead of, say, have interest rates go, 10% higher. So there are ways a government can spin that. We're not expecting a lot of privatization in Sri Lanka. The government as well as our public sector unions have been
Because unfortunately, most of our state-owned enterprises are loss-making.
Yes, of course. And the fact that a lot of our public sector unions are quite opposed to privatization means that publicly and politically it's not very easy.
Correct.
We don't expect a lot of that to happen, but we do expect, therefore, for that exchange rate to be floated, interest rates to rise, and for taxes to increase, primarily on larger corporates, which have seen higher earnings over the last 2 years.
One mention you said right at the start was about that the fact that IMF will ask some of these artificial controls to be taken off, right? So, if you take, for example, the exchange rate right now, banks are, actually the central bank is saying, look, the rate is 200 to 210 rupees per dollar. But Chayu, you and I both know there's no place in this country that you can find dollars for that exact price. I mean, it's very unlikely. Even banks are not fully willing. I don't think that the banks are willing to give at that particular rate. And we know the black market rates are around 230, 240, and so on. So, I'm trying to understand this. What's the point of having an artificially low rate and not having dollars available for purchase? Doesn't it make sense to let the dollar float, as maybe the IMF might say, let it float, and let's say it ends up at 260, 270, and still you can buy dollars at that rate, and somebody who needs to buy it can still buy it. Doesn't that make more sense?
It does make more sense, especially on the face of it. What we've noticed is that in many countries that go through debt crisis, this is exactly what happens. Until the very last moment, you have this official rate business, and you'd say we are not going to devalue the currency until the very last day, and then very suddenly on the next day they're going to say, look, we are going to depreciate the currency.
That's what you call a currency crash?
That's not necessarily a currency crash. A currency crash is, of course, after that, if there's a lot of money flowing out of the country. There are ways that you can kind of prevent that as well. Now, there is a benefit of doing it in that way as opposed to letting the currency float from the beginning, and that is when you have a currency, say, doing 5% depreciation here, 5% there, they can sometimes be the expectation there will be more depreciation, and therefore the market keeps asking for more and more depreciation. As opposed to if you've been controlling it for so long and then you finally let go and move it, say, 20% higher, then the market might think, okay, look, they've been holding it for so long, let's cash it on this opportunity.
Because right now, isn't it a case that a lot of exporters are not cashing in? They are trying to put so many restrictions and rules and trying to force them to convert the rupee, but convert the dollars into rupees, but a lot of exporters are not doing that, and they are trying to manage their finance in other ways without really getting the money into the country. I mean, am I wrong to say that?
I don't think you are, because from the point of view of someone in front of you, an exporter or even any investor, would you rather want your currency something that's going to lose value or something that's not? It seems a rational decision for someone to take. And we do see these kinds of measures taken by central banks across the world. You try all these measures, you try for something that allows you to avoid the pain of the structural reforms, essentially. And when that does not work, usually it gives. And that is what we expect for Sri Lanka as well, for that to give.
What is the outlook of the Sri Lankan economy for the year 2022? Let's talk about that on the other side of the short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back to BISNOMICS. I'm Tharandu Amarasekara, and our focus today is on the topic, the question that the whole country wants an answer for. The IMF. Should we go for it? What will be the consequences? And we are in conversation with Chayu Damsinghe. Chayu, now, a lot of people tend to be kind of confused between the IMF restructuring and the IMF conditions? Because I believe if the IMF comes in, they will want certain debt restructuring. They'll help us to actually ease out some of these debt payments. You can also enlighten us on how much of debt we are due to pay over the next few years. And on the other hand, we also see that the IMF conditions that will be brought in. And these things tend to get highly politicized as well, because we see most of the ministers of the government trying to make IMF the bad guy and say, look, if these guys come in, you will be in trouble. That's why we are not going for it, and so on. And then we hear the opposition saying, no, bring the IMF, and etc. What exactly would be the differentiating factors between these two parties, the IMF first restructuring and the IMF conditions?
So the easiest way that I can say it is the IMF, like I said, wants you to take some sort of action. Right. Restructuring of your debt is one of those actions. Oftentimes, countries don't need to take that action. It's only when you get into such deep distress that restructuring of your debt is required. So what a restructuring means is...
And can we say we are on the way to such a distress as that now?
We are very much in that situation, and it's very...
we are in the zone.
We cannot avoid a restructuring of our debt unless we get a lot of money from somewhere else. And what that restructuring looks like then is where we talk to our credit. We'll first have to tell our creditors, look, we're running out of money. I'm sorry, we can't pay. Let's talk about how we deal with this. Yeah. When you talk to them, it'll take maybe up to a year, and we'll decide how we can pay that later on a better footing that works for us. They'll probably have to take a little bit of a haircut. There's a reduction on their payments. There might be different, different ways that you reschedule that, different ways you package that. All those kinds of things would go ahead with that. Now that the IMF does not, like you rightly said, get directly involved. The IMF merely being with you adds credibility to the process, because you're talking about a country, Sri Lanka or any other country, that has basically not taken the right action. So what...
It's a little similar when, in school days, when we've been a bad boy, you go with the parent, and then the principal is kind of trying to tell you what to do. The fact that your parent is next to you gives a kind of credibility that something will be done.
Exactly. If you tell your teacher, look, no, I'm going to definitely fix everything, what
guarantees there?
Exactly, that's exactly the situation. Now, what the IMF separately does is, in addition to requiring the restructuring, also wants you to take the measures so that once that restructuring is concluded, and once you one day have to pay back your debt, you are actually able to do so once again. So you're not just pushing the problem to the future, you're actually pushing the impacts, and then you're fixing the problem itself. So those conditions end up being, well, like I said earlier, exchange rate devaluation, interest rates keeping up with inflation, and likely higher taxes, possibly privatization as well. Now, those two are separate, but they come at the same time.
Understood. Chayu, now, when you look at the total debt, the foreign debt that we owe to the rest of the world, to whom do we owe the most, and when are these payments due if you look at the next few years?
So we have approximately, as far as the data is available, somewhere between $4 to $5 billion of repayments every year. It's likely there is more for the country overall if you include some private enterprises as well as some SOEs as well. But roughly we have to take that as a guideline, about 4 to 5 billion.
For the next how many years?
I think until about 2027 or 28, it's approximately around that amount.
So we have somewhere around 25 to 30 billion dollars roughly.
I think I think totally we have our total public debt, including, of course, rupee debt is somewhere akin to higher than our gross domestic product.
There's rupee debt as well.
Of course. So I think total debt for the country somewhere that would translate to somewhere around $80 billion. 80 billion. That's roughly equal to our GDP completely.
Oh, wow.
So the rupee debt is generally less of a problem because over time it inflates itself. You roll it over, you issue bonds and bills. It's not too much of a problem for Sri Lanka. It's the foreign debt that's the issue. The vast majority of our foreign debt is in the international credit market. So those are ISBs, and to a lesser extent these local law bonds called SLDBs. Although we do hear a lot about China, China is still only a small component of our external debt. It only starts, even for every year, if we have maybe, I think, anywhere between $300 to $500 million to pay to China, which is a very small amount compared to what we have overall.
So the dragon is not that hot when it comes to the debt market of Sri Lanka yet?
Not yet. Somewhere post 2027 or so, I think it increases to the 800, 900 million amounts, if I remember the figures correctly. At that point, it becomes more of a problem, but it's still not going to be our biggest debt issue. It's still our international commercial borrowings. That's our issue.
One could not stop themselves from asking the question, especially from a learned economist such as yourself, Chayu. So much money borrowed, what has this country done with it?
Sri Lanka's primary, so where Sri Lanka's money has gone, very straightforward answer is that it's gone to fuel our consumption. We have consumed through imports a lot of money. So all this money we borrowed has been given to Sri Lankan people, which has gone to Sri Lankan importers, which has essentially gone out of the country. So basically, a lot of the money we borrowed has already gone out of the country through imports. So that's basically where a lot of the money has
ended
ended
up. And then add to that the conundrum of corruption.
There is that conundrum of corruption. Of course, we don't necessarily think that on the foreign debt side, corruption has been a very big issue. Because these are things that have a lot of legal safeguards as well. So unless if you're talking about more opaque forms of some bilateral debt, which again for Sri Lanka isn't very much of an issue, corruption probably not for foreign debt, but of course it is a problem that permeates across the board
Correct.
as well.
Any examples or case studies of successful IMF program-based restructuring and countries that have come out of the debt crisis due to the IMF support?
I'll give you a few examples of countries that have done it well and countries that haven't.
Yeah.
So if I start with countries that haven't, Argentina and Pakistan are good examples because these are countries, like I said earlier, start IMF programs, do a little bit of the adjustment and then let it go. That means they keep going on and on and on.
Correct.
That's so far the path that Sri Lanka has also been on. Hopefully we get out of that. Countries that get out of that often either have to take a very large hit first.
What kind of hits?
We are talking
high taxes?
Not necessarily just high taxes. For example, if I will give the example of Ecuador. Ecuador is now a dollarized economy. They don't have a local currency. So that the process of transitioning is a very large one. It can. So that country, for example, they recently had a restructuring of their debt. Of course, their dollarization happened much earlier. Was considered an exemplary restructuring. Everyone's praising it. Was done very well. So that's an example of a country that has done well. Mongolia in 2016 did a restructuring ahead of time with very minimal impacts onto the economy because they did it ahead of time. Also another option of a country that has done well. It's difficult for Sri Lanka to go that path just now because we are so late, which means what we have to do is to take those painful reforms if we are going down the IMF path. Of course, the other option is to take fewer of the reforms and then hope that a bilateral partner will give us some additional funding until one day tourism come back.
We are still falling into debt, and I believe most of the bilateral partner support will come with more of political conditions.
That is very true. So that is if we get some the possibility is if you take some IMF conditions.
Yeah.
And then
so we were discussing about these conditions, possibly high taxes, higher interest rates, maybe definitely a higher exchange rate, or rather a further depreciation of the currency as well. Is there a possibility that I think I asked this earlier as well, because people are saying, the ministers are saying that if we go to this, the government jobs will be cut and all that. But the way you see it, Chayu, what are the possible, like when you look at the other countries, what are the conditions they've put on some of these other countries?
So the conditions tend to be that they're not like, there are some times when countries control inflation, especially through money printing, for that to be reversed. Thankfully, Sri Lanka is already on that pathway. The exchange rate has to be floated, and all controls, so import controls that we have, other capital flow controls generally have to be relaxed, maybe not overnight, but over a period of a few months, not over a very long time though. Taxes likely going to be both on indirect taxes like VAT, because those are easier to collect, but also a high profile tax on higher corporates as well, just to make it seem less punitive to the common man. Those are the kinds of conditions that we've seen in these other countries.
How gloomy is the outlook of the Sri Lankan economy for the year 2022, Chayu?
Unless we get a lot of money, it's going to be quite difficult to avoid a very tough year.
In 2022, and we are here.
2022 is going to be a very tough year. Yes, 2022 itself is going to be a very tough year, and it's something that we think that expecting a very strong recovery for 2022 is probably something that we'll have to let go, because
it's a candy coin dream.
It's ideal if we have it, but it does not seem likely to be achieved. Probably a tough year. I'm not saying a contraction or a recession necessarily, but a weaker recovery possibly, or just conditions to be overall quite tough. A lot of people to face a lot of pain. So
will we be heavily dependent on a possible recovery of the tourism sector as well?
We will be, but the benefit, of course, of all this pain is that after that pain is done, after 2022 is done, maybe a little bit in 2023 as well, very little bit, what we've seen from other countries that afterwards they do quite well. So even if it's not a sovereign debt country, I'll give the example of the countries during the Asian financial crisis.
So 1998.
1997, 1998 period got massive hits, took massive hits to the economy for a year, but the recovery afterwards was really good. I mean, Indonesia, for example, the GDP per capita halved in 1 year. But now you would consider Indonesia a much stronger economy than it was in the 1990s. And that's generally what you would expect to happen after that pain has happened. The economy recovers and recovers to a much better place than it was earlier.
Chayu, before we end up, I want to share a very interesting research fact which I have come across. I'm sure you know this as well, being a lead economist, that wherever there is wherever there is an era where tall buildings are coming up, usually it's followed by very painful economic times. 1930s Empire State Building in US, and we saw the US crisis. Then in 1990s with the Petronas towers and all coming up, we saw the whole aspect of the Asian financial crisis. In the Gulf, we saw many tall towers, and then the global financial crisis came in the late 2008-9 time period. And is the case that Sri Lanka is also having too many tall buildings coming up, and is that the direction we are going in? Is this very uneconomic theory proving correct in Sri Lanka as well?
It's not very uneconomic, because what happens before the crisis is that you have a lot of essentially cheap money that goes into
a lot of optimism and unfounded optimism.
Optimism and unproductive enterprises. What's the technical term for it? And ultimately, you end up in a place you have a lot of things that look nice.
Yes.
But you're at the very last moment before a crisis, at the very top of a bubble, basically.
Correct.
Things aren't very productive, and what's next is the crash happens. And for Sri Lanka, I think we're already in the crash. The crash is going to take some time to resolve, but after that resolution, we do think that the country will be in a much stronger place.
Hopefully, the landing will be hard but bearable.
Bearable.
Chayu Damsinghe, thank you so much for joining us, and I believe the good work that young economists such as yourself are doing and contributing to the business sector of this country with is indeed vital to help the business decision makers to make the right decisions. Thank you for joining us, and keep up the good work, because good, talented people such as yourself are indeed some of the hope that people still have about this country. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Zanin, and thank you for the kind words.
Well, there you have it. It's going to be a tough year, but there is hope. Let's hope that the right authorities will take the necessary actions and make sure that even if a certain economic pain is there to be brought upon us, may it be a case where that pain is brought upon us earlier than later, to ensure that our economy does not crash into a deeper abyss, and to make sure that we come out of it as a stronger and resilient nation. I'm Thalindu Amarasekara, and as always, looking forward to being with you this year to make sure that your week ahead stays profitable no matter what industry you may be in. I will see you with the next episode. This is BISNOMICS.